Welcome back. This is week 2, lecture 1, The Emergence of Civilization, Ancient Mesopotamia. Now, in the previous lectures, 2 lectures, I think I tried to problematize the concepts of history, Western, and civilization. And in the last lecture, I focused on the problem of the term history. What does the term history signify? What do we use and what are we meaning and referring to when we use the word history? And I gave 6 definitions, possible definitions for how the word has been used in what contexts. Today, we focus on civilization, which even though I think I've, in the first lecture anyway or so, problematized a bit, because what constitutes civilization and what's the distinction between human culture and human civilization. And I define civilization as a distinctive form of human culture, that there was human culture before there was civilization. And in general, scholars date civilization to approximately 4000 to 3500 BCE, arising in Mesopotamia. And the term civilization comes from the Latin term civis, civitas, or civilis, which means either citizen, city, or civil. And somehow civilization is inherently, by definition, life in cities. But then the question becomes, what is a city? What constitutes a city? And scholars debate this because certainly, obviously, perhaps, how we define a city is directly relevant to our understanding of the emergence of civilization. One general definition by historians and archaeologists for a city is a concentrated, settled group of human population with a wall and at least one monumental structure, usually a temple or a palace, and sometimes those are one and the same. There's a challenge to this definition. We'll be talking more about this as we go. But this is, again, it's not the only definition given, but it is a commonly accepted one, because there's been for 30, 40, 50 years or so now, I forget exactly how long, an excavation going on in the city of Çatalhöyük, which is in modern, what we today call Turkey. And this development seems to challenge our very definition of a city. And the issue is that it dates to approximately 7500 BCE, so almost 3,000 to 4,000 years previous to when we had traditionally thought that civilization first emerged. So we're going to look at Çatalhöyük a little bit to see some of the problems and issues before then turning to Mesopotamia, because Mesopotamia is a very different region than Turkey. And I'm putting this forward not as this is where civilization began in any way, shape, or form, but just to illustrate the debate and the issues that are involved when we're trying to define terms and then use terms to describe what we see in the extant evidence. Now, obviously, there are no written sources from Çatalhöyük. The written sources that define the historical period first emerge in ancient Mesopotamia, which I'll be talking about. And so that would then question, if we define Çatalhöyük as a city, and therefore the origins of civilization, that changes our perspective on civilization. So this is an outlier, by and large. There are a couple of other excavated sites that are somewhat similar, but this is an issue, and there's actually a website you can go to, Çatalhöyük, and see the excavations that are still ongoing. I have pictures in the PowerPoint slide presentation, which I'll be showing you shortly, of some of these, of some of the sites, reconstructions. But that's what we're really kind of focusing on, is what is civilization and what does it mean when we talk about civilized society and how we distinguish that from human culture and what difference does all that make anyway. But if we're looking at the history of Western civilization, the big question here is that civilization, as a distinct form of human culture, only becomes Western much, much later. But we'll be focusing on that question a lot. Anyway, that's kind of what we're looking at. Now, if we go then to the first slide, or second slide actually on the PowerPoint, the first city, Catalhuyuk. We see there that it's a Neolithic settlement, and the Neolithic is the new Stone Age, which dates to approximately 7,500 BCE. As I didn't mention this, but it has an estimated population, or had an estimated population between 5,000 or 10,000 people, and so it is all of a sudden, it is that concentrated settlement. Now, human culture and human groups had been hunters and gatherers. We know that. That means they moved around with the seasons, with the herds, with the crops, or the plants, not crops, because agriculture was really only beginning sort of about this time. But we're looking at the issue of the transition from a hunter and gatherer society and social organization to a settled society. And with agriculture, we talk about the agricultural revolution, which is just about this time of Catalhuyuk, around 7,500 to 8,000 BCE, or approximately 10,000 years ago, when we first find evidence of agriculture, and animal husbandry, domestication of animals, growing crops, which then alleviates the need for hunting and gathering, or so it would seem. Now, this gets all kind of complex, and the evidence is very meager, and so we're trying to piece together different little pieces of evidence, even if I shouldn't say little, but sparse pieces of evidence, to kind of construct what really was going on in terms of the early emergence of cities and therefore of civilizations. There is evidence for this agricultural revolution, or what's called the Neolithic Revolution, as it's called, because it changes human social structure. If you don't have to, always be moving around following the crops, because that's agriculture, but following what the vegetation and the natural growth of the seasons of different plants that you can eat, and also the herds and hunting, that is a very different structure than a settled region. In some ways, we'll see the same issue in the early Middle Ages with the Germanic tribes, but we'll get there when we get there. Don't worry about that right now, because that's already after it's clear that civilization had already arisen. So Catalhuyuk is a real perplexity, because on the one hand, it was a settlement, and there was seemingly specialization, because that's the other aspect. Once we have a concentrated settlement of a population, we start seeing specialization in terms of functions and forms. We can say, well, yes, with hunter and gatherers are people who hunted, and people who then prepared the produce of the hunting. So there is some different tasks that were not necessarily all together, but when you have a settlement, that division of labor really becomes more clear and more demarcated. Now, here is a picture, the first picture here of Catalhuyuk. Now, this is a reconstruction, an artistic reconstruction of what it might have looked like. And what we see there is this mound, and then structures built upon this mound. So there is this concentrated settlement without question. That is not an issue. But going back to the definition of a city that I gave, generally accepted definition, there is no wall. And we do not see a monumental structure, such as a palace or temple. So what does that mean? And number one. And number two, there's also evidence that the people who lived in Catalhuyuk not only were settled and somewhat engaged in husbandry, whether it's plant husbandry or animal husbandry, settlement, agricultural part of this early part of the agricultural revolution, but were also hunters and gatherers. So they combined both the forms of hunting and gathering of human organization, as well as this dense settlement staying in one place. So what does that all mean? Now, we don't know. That's what we're trying to discover and still figure out. The next slide there is more of an archaeological schemata of the settlement, reconstructed from the excavations, and then there's an actual picture of the actual excavations as they're still going on, and so that we can see that this was this settlement with divisions, of course, in different types of buildings, etc. And there may have been a temple, or at least a place of worship, that just doesn't appear as a monumental structure. There may have been a structure, a building that served as a palace, or at least the house of the king or the leader, but we don't know that yet. But still, if there was, it was not a monumental structure. And by monumental, I think you know what I mean. Just a larger, clearer structure that stands out from all the rest. So that's what we're looking at here. Now, this was a developed society, and it was also a society with culture and with religion. I'm already been talking about religion as a major part of the course and focus from it. But it's very interesting because there were figurines found, or have been found, in Catalhoyuk excavations. And this next slide, there is an example of one of the figurines that has been found there. Now, this is clearly a female figure with emphasized breasts, belly, and thighs. This is what most scholars assume is a mother goddess. It is a mother goddess worshiping fertility. Fertility was essential for these new settlements in the Neolithic with the agricultural revolution, because once you are growing crops, that is based on the fertility of the land and the weather patterns and everything else. So all of a sudden you're dependent not on the flow of the animals and the different herds and things that you follow along as they are traveling around to find food, and as you are traveling around to find food, whatever it might be in terms of also vegetation, but also the animals themselves. But once you're settled, you really need to have a fertility of what you're growing there. Now, the issue here, and the funny thing is here, I don't have a picture of it, but some of you may have already seen it from previous courses or from high school courses or so. This figurine found in Catalhoyuk is basically exactly the same figurine. Was found in sites in Europe that are known as the Venus of Willendorf. The same type of figurine, also considered to be a fertility goddess, even though there was no evidence that it was based on settlement or agriculture, because the Venus of Willendorf dates back to approximately 29,000 years ago, or about 2,500 years before the development of civilization, or 18,000 years before, if we look at Catalhoyuk. So there's something that was common, because this was from Northern Europe, and the Venus of Willendorf was from Northern Europe, whereas this figurine from Catalhoyuk is almost exactly the same. So there was something about the religion of these early settlements, as well as hunter and gathering societies, as well as just human culture as such, that focused on the mother goddess and fertility. That would change with civilization and the real rise of cities. And that changes everything in terms of the development of human beings and how they organize themselves and what they believe and everything else. So I mentioned these aspects simply as indications of what might still in time transform our understanding of the whole development and emergence of civilization. It's a question mark. It's not, quote unquote, fact yet. This is not necessarily where the story begins, and it's certainly not the story of where Western civilization begins. But it could be part of our new developing understanding of where does civilization begin. So given that question or challenge to the grand narrative, which I've talked about in the past, that grand narrative of the origins and development of civilization. We need to be aware of that. I'm going to then go back and focus on that grand narrative, some of the generally accepted concepts and principles of when did civilization emerge and what was it all about and where did it all emerge. For that, then we turn to the birthplace of civilization, which was ancient Mesopotamia. Now, on the next slide on PowerPoints, we see the birthplace of civilization. We see a map. And the green on the map, not the green from Lower Egypt into Upper Egypt and the Nile and all of that, but the green part to the right of that shows an area of Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia means between the two rivers. There's the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. It's part of what's called the Fertile Crescent, which you can kind of see there on the map. It's kind of a crescent-shaped area, but civilization arose in the first cities arose in southern Mesopotamia. If we go to the next map, which is more focused in detail, this is Mesopotamia up close, and we see there Sumer, Babylonia, Akkad, and up in the north of Syria. And in Sumer, we see cities, Uruk, Ur, Lakash, etc. Of course, with Babylonia is Babylon. That was basically in Akkad. So these are regions within Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is the whole region. Sumer is the southern part of Mesopotamia, in which there were individual cities, and I'll be talking about city-states. These were independent political entities that did have walls and monumental structures. That's what we're kind of talking about. They also developed cultural developments, even scientific developments, that we also associate with civilization. And that starts in Sumer. And the Sumerians is a general term for people living in the region of Sumer. Sumer was not a state. It was not even a unified people. It was just people living in the region that is designated as Sumer. There was a common language, Sumerian, that for a long time was not deciphered. It was a non-Indo-European language, and it was very difficult to decipher. I'll get to that too as we go through things. But what are the things we find emerging at this time? Again, sometime approximately between 4000 BCE and 3500 BCE, or even could go back to 4200 BCE. Scholars have dated some of the evidence variously. Is a development not only of the settlement, division of labor, monumental structures, religion, based on that in the temple and things, or monuments and palaces, but also cultural developments and the emergence of writing. It's here in Sumer that we find the earliest evidence of writing, which then again demarcates the prehistorical period from the historical period. Even though we can, as I discussed in the last lecture or so, can and have been written frequently, we can write a history of prehistoric times. Prehistoric times simply means before writing developed. So what led to the development of writing? Now, writing as revolution up there. This is the next slide, the title, Development of Writing. Writing is revolution, and it changed everything once you learn how to write. You might think that's not really the case because we just take writing for granted. And yet, think about this. How did computers and the internet change social structures and change society and change everything? Depending on how old you are, so to speak, you may not remember this. You may not have lived through this, but for those of us, or certainly for me, in any case, even if I'm the only one in this age category, it changed everything. A new technology, a new information technology of communicating information, of storing information, of communicating thoughts and ideas, developed with the internet, and it has changed so much. And I'm not going to go off on that, but that's another technological revolution But similarly, the development of writing was likewise a revolution in everything. There's an anthropologist called, or was an anthropologist called Claude Levi-Strauss, major 20th century figure. I won't go into all of the things that he did, but he had studied indigenous peoples in South America. I believe it was. I have to go back, but I believe it was in South America. And he has an article called The Writing Lesson. I should have posted it and assigned it, but you have enough reading to do anyway. In his writing lesson, what it was what they did in this one group. They taught them how to write. It was an oral culture. Oral culture is very distinct and different from written culture. And what these anthropologists coming into this indigenous culture, oral culture, you can say prehistoric culture, even though this was 20th century, writing changed everything. It was the leaders, the king, for lack of a better term, or the leader, the political leader of the group that wanted to learn how to write. And they did that. They thought, this is great, we'll learn how to write. And then they started controlling who could learn how to write. Because writing is power. And once we introduce something written, that introduces a new power relationship, and that has to be managed and organized. And those in power want to use that new power of the written word for their own benefit. Now, that is, you can say, well, that's not really quite what was going on. That could be, but that's the general view of what writing led to. And we'll see that too in Mesopotamia. Because when we go back to Mesopotamia, we have to say, okay, how did writing develop that led to this revolution? I have up here from tokens to wedges, the development of cuneiform. The first evidence of what we call writing is known as cuneiform. And cuneiform is just a Latin term, anglicized, meaning wedge-shaped writing. If you look back at the next slide, you'll see that there's a tablet, a clay tablet. That is what they wrote on. And you'll see markings in that tablet. These were written with a stylus punched into the clay. And this is language. This is written language. It becomes very complex. And you can see the different cuneiform things. Just as what it's like in terms of the wedge-shaped writing. And it becomes really a problem to understand, how did this start and how did it all develop and what does it all mean? Especially, is it, the writing is basically Sumerian, in the Sumerian language, so we couldn't even really decipher it at first. Interestingly enough, how we could decipher it ended up deciphering it. Scholars, and this goes back, I'm not sure if it was late 19th century or when it was actually developed that Sumerian was deciphered, is because, as I'll talk about before too long in this lecture, the Akkadians, under Akkad, they're in more central or northern Mesopotamia, conquered Sumer, entire region. And they introduced their own language, Akkadian. Now, Akkadian was an Indo-European language, just as is Hebrew. It's different from Hebrew, obviously, but it's still that Semitic language. And because scholars could decipher and had deciphered Akkadian based on that language group, they could then use that to help them with deciphering Sumerian. Because what the Akkadians did when they conquered Sumer, they preserved Sumerian as a ritual language, much like Latin has become, at least within the Roman Catholic Church. There's still Latin is being used, but it's not, quote unquote, a living language, and that gets to be a whole other issue and problem and everything else. But the point here, I hope that will make some sense to you, that it wasn't just discarded or gotten rid of, but it was seen as this ancient, almost powerful, ritual language that the Akkadians preserved. They had to, though, learn it and teach it. So some of the earliest texts we have, we'll come back to that, some of the earliest texts we have are what's called word lists. Lists of words in Akkadian and then their Sumerian counterpart. Actually, a colleague of mine early on when I was in Groningen in the Netherlands was working his PhD on I think it was the tree list, the list of trees, because it's so fascinating how they put everything together. They have these different word lists organized by categories of things. So it gets into the whole understanding of their worldview. There's a king list, a tree list, and I think probably a mineral list or so. But because they have these bilingual lists to teach their own scribes how to write the ritual language so they can be used in a ritual setting, we modern European American scholars, were able to then say, okay, we know what this word or symbol is in Akkadian. That's what this is in Sumerian. So they begin to be able to figure out Sumerian because of these word lists. And yet, that was not the origins of writing. It had already developed, because with cuneiform, why write? Why do we do this? It's been also noted that the earliest texts, even before these word lists, were economic inventories. Two types of text: economic inventories, just what you had. It's a long story, but someone would say, okay, I need to make a record of how many sheep I have and how many bales of hay I have or whatever, and they would mark it down on the clay tablet. Those symbols then became to symbolize the thing that they had. Language is a symbolic system and becomes a very abstract symbolic system. And I could say a lot about this. I'm not going to go into it in too much depth because I do want to get through this lecture in decent time. But it was a way of keeping track. And why do you need to keep track? For trade. Trade is a major economic function. And there was long-distance trade already with Mesopotamia. There is a stone, a gem, called lapis lazuli. It's a blue, very beautiful blue stone. And that was seen as the, let's say, money or the means of wealth in ancient Mesopotamia. But the nearest source, nearest mines, the source of lapis lazuli was like 1,400 miles away. So they would go and bring lapis lazuli back from its origins 1,400 miles away to Mesopotamia. There's already a long distance trade, but there's also trade going on within Sumer for goods and services. Money, real money, has not developed yet. What we think, but money too is simply a medium of exchange. And before that, there is barter, and I'll give you this if you give me that. So the theory to interpret the evidence that exists today is that based on this trade, it became increasingly important to know what you own, what was yours. Because with the inventories, because of basically, being disadvantaged in trade. You have a record. If you agree with someone, okay, I will give you 5 bales of hay if you give me 1 sheep. And then they give you 1 sheep and you give them 3 bales of hay. And they say, wait a minute, you said 5 bales of hay. And they said, no, I didn't. I said 3. That's going to lead to a conflict, depending on who's stronger, so to speak. But even let's say it goes to the king to judge, because it's a problem. They complain, and the king says, okay, what's the evidence? There is no evidence. But once you have writing, you can put that all in writing based on the inventories. And the other type of earliest document we have written thing are contracts. Contracts for trade. And it's fascinating to see what is coming out of this. So it's all basically for this economic development. And it's not so much the profit motive, even though that's kind of there too. It's not capitalism as we know it. It's simply survival in many ways and how to get what you need to live. Obviously, people wanted to have more than other people, but it's to protect your own interests. And so we have these tablets And they are inventories and contracts. And then we get to the higher level of letters and writing, and I'll be talking about later stories, etc. But that is the whole origins of the development of writing. Now, there too, writing, knowledge, and power, because once you have writing, you record things, you have knowledge stored, not simply based on memory, but based on a record of what had gone on. Knowledge is power. It still is, sort of, even though we're moving beyond that, but that's a whole other issue. So the issue, like I talked about the writing, Strauss's The Writing Lesson, needs to be managed and contained. And so we have the kings of the city-states in Mesopotamia managing and co-opting the power of writing. It also needs education to teach other people how to write. So the development in Mesopotamia became of schools and schooling. They were known as the Aduba, and the Aduba just means tablet house. A tablet house was usually associated with either the palace or the temple, or the same, one and the same altogether. So we have this issue of learning how to write. So you have the king, you have then the scholars coming from school teaching writing. And here already we see a very familiar structure, because there was someone who was called the master of the Aduba, the master of the tablet house, who would teach people how to write. Now, advanced students would teach more new students. And so the master would give his instructions, and then the advanced students would go over it and really do, like, let's say, the practical teaching of the material with the newer students separately. Basically, it's the same structure as professor, graduate students, and undergraduates. That was how it was all set up. And these Aduba, again, were associated with kingly power and with priestly power. And we see then, because of this structure, we see increasingly the emergence of an elite class. Now, class is a term that is anachronistically used to refer to divisions, social divisions at this time, but it still works. That's, let's say, a technical point in terms of the term class. If you are aware that this is in a non-technical sense, using class as just different groups of people, types of groups of people, that's okay. So there was a class of scholars, educated priests, and kings who were all together, the emergence of the elite, and then everyone else. And so it was controlled who could learn to write, who could be part of this power structure of the elite. And part of that, too, was then using religion to support that. Now, this is not an issue of me saying, well, religion is simply to support the elite. It certainly can be. Whether it is true or not is a separate issue. And as I think I've already said in lectures or wrote about, it's not an issue of what is true in terms of religion. The god Marduk that was worshipped in ancient Mesopotamia, I'll talk a little bit about shortly. The question the historian cannot answer is, was that true? Is Marduk true? Now, I'm assuming that none of you worship Marduk. If you do, I hope you won't be offended by some of the things I'm going to say. But it applies to every religion, basically. The historian can only look at what is believed and how that belief functioned in society. Those are historically verifiable developments based on the evidence. The historian cannot make theological statements of the truth value of these texts, these religious beliefs. That's what is really going on. So we go from this emergence of civilization, development of writing with walls and a monumental structure, development of writing, development of religion. We'll see a couple more as we go through the rest of the lecture. So let's look a little bit then at Mesopotamian religion. Religion evolves. I have up there the numinous universe. Now, a numen is a manifestation of the divine. That's the only thing it means. It means a manifestation of the divine. And the earliest religious beliefs, anthropologists, historians believe, was a numinous universe where all that there is a manifestation of the divine. Makes perfect sense. Because even in this ancient period, there are forces that humans didn't understand. You can say, well, that doesn't make sense to talk about the god of the forest, the god of thunder, the sun god, all these different gods. That becomes an I can't even say that term. I'm sorry, my apologies. I'm rather tired at the moment, and I can't think of anthropomorphic. And that's an anthropomorphic. That's an anthropomorphicization, so to speak. What a horrible word, of powers. And powers are without understanding. And early on, no, human beings back in 4000 or 3500 BCE or 3000 BCE or even 2500 BCE did not understand the physical causes of thunder and lightning, did not understand really how the seasons worked and the structures and the tides and the flooding seasons and all those different aspects of our physical world. So they made it into gods, and it's very rational. It's like, this is happening. I don't understand why and how it's happening. So it must be something that is superhuman that is causing this, because I can't do this. I can't make it rain. And it seemingly rains, without any order. So there must be something that's making it rain that is superhuman. Therefore, divine. And that then goes from this power of rain in the numinous universe to then a personification or an anthropomorphized representation of the power into rain god, thunder god, sun god, god of the forest. Because it's scary. Forests are scary. People can go into the forest and get killed by wild animals. If people are waiting for them to come back, they have no idea. They just disappear. What the hell is going on there? That's scary. So the whole point is that religion develops from this numinous universe to an anthropomorphized deification of these natural forces. And we already saw the issue of the fertility goddess, because especially with the agricultural revolution, the Neolithic revolution, and the settlement and the development of agriculture, fertility was essential to these early ancient societies. We'll see that with Egypt too, with the flooding of the Nile. How do we try to manage all of the natural phenomena so that the land itself, the earth itself, can be fertile sufficiently to support us? That was the question that was from the very beginning, and it's still with us today. How do we deal with global warming? How do we deal with drilling for oil? We need oil, but aren't we actually undermining ourselves? Are we actually destroying the planet that is the source of our life? Those are questions that I'm not trying to argue for one position or the other, but the management of natural resources, let's say, for the vitality of life is the same issue, even though it's different problems, but the same issue as was there from the very beginnings of human culture, and then human civilization is a distinct form of human culture. So it makes perfect sense that we would see then too in ancient Mesopotamia figurines found early on of the mother goddess. And here we see, just like in Catalhoyuk and just like the Venus of Willendorf, female figurine with an accentuated breasts, belly, and thighs of fertility, a fertility goddess, a mother goddess. And it's generally assumed that the mother goddess was one of the earliest forms of religious belief in the divine. And I have it there too, the male ification of the pantheon. The pantheon is simply all of the gods put together. So if we had the sun god, the forest god, the rain god, whatever, all of the deities together form the pantheon. And the mother goddess is one of those. And the mother goddess originally, it's been theorized based on the evidence, was the primary deity. From before civilization, going all back to ways to human culture, the very emergence of religion within. Actually, we find evidence of religious belief in the Neanderthals with the ritual burials and things. But it goes all the way back then to long before civilization arose. The fertility goddess, the mother goddess, is primary. We see a change with the emergence of civilization from a female mother goddess to male gods. Now, if you know Latin, that's why you say, why did I put malification? Why did I use a hyphen between male and ification and then put it in quotation marks? Because that's a play on words. In Latin, malus, mala, male is an adjective meaning evil. What we find is this complete change in the function of religion with civilization, where it becomes predominantly male gods take over, male warrior gods. That's what happens. That's why I play with it, the male-ification. What I mean by that is the shift from the mother goddess to male gods. Now, if you look at that next slide after the mother goddess figurine, here is a representation of early representation of some of the Mesopotamian pantheon. They had over 2,500 gods. And you see here too on this slide that the overwhelming biggest figurines and figures are male, with the beards, and so the person standing at the back. And the female representations are somewhat lesser. You can still see there, if you look at the tallest guy with the eyes wide open and the beard, to his right, to our left, in more brownish tone, is what seems to be the fertility goddess, not symbolized by breasts, belly, and thighs, but by wearing wheat, by wearing the produces of the earth. This was become very common part of the Greek pantheon, part of the Roman pantheon. It is then this transformation from human reproduction and fertility to very clearly agricultural production. So the fertility goddess becomes the goddess of agriculture. And yet here, she's put definitely in an inferior position to the male gods. The big god there in the middle, and then on his left, on our right, also more brownish color, also a male god, and it looks like you have next to him maybe a eunuch who serves the two big gods and the other people around. So we can see this shift from female to male within the pantheon. And then here's another slide with not a fresco, but a relief. And you see it too. Male god, male god, male god, male god, male god. And obviously there are issues of conflict here. So and there's the knife thing sticking up, and there's animals around here because there's arrows in the male god. War and combat become more important. And once we have war and combat, that is part of the shift to the male god. This is just this fascinating development in early civilization. And we see that happening in ancient Mesopotamia already. So that is part of this malification too. And then also it brings up the question of why build walls? If walls is part of the definition of a city, why build walls? Well, there's two questions or two answers: to keep people out or to keep people in. Why would you want to keep people out? It's because we in our settlement here have a good thing going. We have produce. We're storing. We're building up storehouses of food and things, and we don't want people, hunters and gatherers, as they go through around, seeing, oh, we're going to go and take this. That's what hunters and gatherers would do. I mean, why have to go and kill animals and pick berries and everything? If there's a stockpile, you can just take from. So we're going to build a wall to protect from outsiders coming in to take what we have. It's going to be a defensive wall. Because what is implied is if we don't have that wall, they'll come in and we'll have to always be there fighting them, meaning it's always the threat of violence. In some ways, violence is inherent in the origins of civilization. We so often think of, I'm civilized. It's so good to be civilized. Isn't it nice to be civilized? And, oh, you uncivilized people. But if civilization itself is based on violence, what does that tell us about civilization? It's a question mark I want you to think about, because that ties into the issue of justice, which I'll get to shortly, and is the theme for this whole course. So that's where this whole malification comes in this issue of power. It's an issue of the king and priest working together over the people, and then protecting the people with the wall and with military force. And it becomes all one of the same complex: politics, military, power, and the state, and religion. And here is a picture. This next picture is a temple, the ziggurat, which was in ancient Mesopotamia, not quite as big as the pyramids in Egypt, but it is the same kind of a structure building up, and it's a temple. And also the aduba could be part of that as well. I'm not always sure. That is to a structure of a hierarchy. That which is above humans, the superhuman, is above us. And so there's almost a natural hierarchy that develops, whereby we have the pantheon of the gods, then we have the kings, rulers, and the priests, the elite, then we have everybody else. And that structure is really important because it led to the representation of the state itself as divine. So what we see very early on in the development of Mesopotamia in these cities, each city was an independent state led by a king with sovereignty. We'll talk more about that as we go through the course. But in representing the state as divine, the king has either divine themselves. Well, the pharaoh was seen as kind of divine. In Mesopotamia, the kings were not seen themselves as divine, but as serving the gods, usually a particular god. And so the whole state structure of these city-states was seen as a divine manifestation. So there's still that aspect of the numinous universe. It's just based then on the malification of the pantheon, whereby the state as divine is itself a numen, a manifestation of the divine, even if it's very transformed from what had come before civilization had arose. With that view of the malification of the pantheon, of religion, the state as divine, power, structure, violence, we also then have the emergence of empire. In this next slide, the emergence of empire. And the question then becomes, as always, how is empire defined? What is an empire? For practical purposes, we can define an empire here in very general, broad terms as one political entity exercising hegemonic authority and control over other political entities. Now that can be very amorphous, and so you can have one political entity, let's say, ruling another city. That doesn't really constitute an empire, so it becomes a question of when does hegemonic just means control over. So if we have control over not just the city itself, but then other cities around, or satellite cities or clientele cities, pretty soon we get to have a larger rule for that one city. And then at some point, as it keeps expanding, we have empire. So we think of these great empires, the Roman Empire, the Persian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, and things, and on we can go, the British Empire, as these huge structures. Here, I'm trying to get a basic definition to describe the phenomenon itself of what leads to being an empire. What we can see is with the emergence of empire is this fusion and harmonization of religion, economics, and power. One of the first developments in what scholars still debate, first empires, is known as the Uruk expansion. Uruk, a city-state in Sumer, go back in the map, you can see where it is, began to, through trade routes, exercise hegemonic control over also further up into Mesopotamia. Not all of Mesopotamia, but there is long-distance trade, and they started establishing trading posts, so that there was an economic influence of Uruk that at least economically had control, hegemonic control. What we mean by that is, okay, does that then constitute empire? Can you have just an economic empire, or does it necessarily have to be also political control? That's a question. But so scholars debate whether this Uruk, one of the states in Sumer, actually established the first empire by means of this economic trading outposts reaching out throughout the region. But in general, scholars agree that whether or not that was the case, if it is, it's going to change things. But aside from that, the first empire was established by Sargon of Akkad, approximately 2350 BCE. And Sargon was from Akkad, north of Sumer, still within Mesopotamia. And Sargon was the king of Akkad. And maybe it could have been, we don't know this for sure, in reaction to the Uruk expansion that Sargon said, I'm just going to go in and establish my authority. And he conquers southern Mesopotamia, he conquers Sumer, all of Sumer. And what does he do? He establishes then his own god, Marduk, as the major god. He forces the priests to adhere to him and to agree that he is ruling for Marduk on earth. And he exerts his rulership and control over all of Sumer, as well as in Akkad. So essentially, he's the first empire, almost all of Mesopotamia, under Sargon. Now, with this whole construct of religion, economics, power, violence, civilization, writing, the whole bit, part of this understanding of who we are, meaning at the time, led to then accounts to justify what we were doing, so to speak, what they were doing. And we have also then not only the emergence of civilization, the emergence of writing, the emergence of empire, we also have the emergence of myth. Now here, I think I've said a couple of times that myth, as I use the term here, is not that which is false. It is a truth, an experienced truth that can't be articulated in any other way. So what is a myth expresses an experienced truth. Whether it's literally true or not is completely irrelevant. As we'll see, I have two myths up here. I'm going to talk about from ancient Mesopotamia. The first is the myth of creation, the ancient Babylonian, which is Akkadian, creation myth, which is simply a form of other myths at the time, but it's the most complete form, is from Babylon. It's called the Enuma Elish. I think in the written lectures it's spelled out there, Enuma Elish. And it is, very quickly, I'll just go through it. The story is this: there was the major god Apsu, Apsu's wife Tiamat, and they had children, and Apsu gets all upset because he can't sleep because the offspring are making too much noise. And then Tiamat says, "Don't worry, sweetheart, I'll take care of it. I'll just get rid of all of them. I'll just get rid of all of them." He goes, "Okay, good. I'm sick and tired of those damn kids. Can't get any sleep." Now, even right here, did the ancient Mesopotamians and Babylonians really believe that they believe probably in a god they call Apsu? Do they really believe in that level of anthropomorphication? Sorry, I don't know why I have such a problem with that term today. In that, really the god says, "I can't get any sleep," or was it an account for what they experienced in human terms. So they're using very human terms, applying that to the story of the gods to explain what was going on. So anyway, so the story goes that Tiamat says, "Okay, we'll just get rid of them all. We'll wipe them all out." One of the kids or grandkids, I forget actually which got wind of this and gathered all the children of Apsu and Tiamat and their children together. So, Mom is going to kill us all. What are we going to do? We have to stand up. And most of them said, I'm not going to do it. I don't want to do this. But Marduk, who I believe actually was a grandchild, said, I'll do it. I'll go and I'll fight Tiamat. He said, okay. So they all hail for Marduk, who will save us all. So Marduk goes and meets Tiamat in a fierce battle. And it goes back and forth, but one of the things that Marduk controlled was the four winds. He marshaled the power of the four winds, north, south, east, and west, thrust them in Tiamat's mouth, and then they split her apart and killed Tiamat. Apsu doesn't say what Apsu was doing. He's probably up there saying, uh-oh, shit. Anyway, so Marduk then goes upon the carcass of Tiamat, smashes her skull, and takes her carcass and throws it up to the firmament to create the firmament. And he also created human beings. Because he says, this is what we can do. We can create creatures whose purpose is to appease the gods, keep the gods happy so we won't have heavenly war, so to speak. So this one happened again. I'm the conqueror. Apsu kind of fades away. But, Tiamat's gone. I've preserved the pantheon, the gods. I've then divided the heavenly realm from when I'm creating the human realm. And the whole point of the human realm is to worship and serve and appease the gods. And that is the Enuma Elish, in essence, the plot, the Babylonian creation myth, which accounts for where did humans come from? What is their purpose in life? What is the purpose of life? How did they emerge? And what is the form of religion and the gods and everything else? So that is just an amazing myth to explain an experienced reality. It's also to give a justification for kings and their religious beliefs and worship and serving and ruling for the gods, because the gods are what must be appeased. And if I am Sargon, or and so I can say I am ruling for Marduk, and so our whole purpose is to appease the gods. And me and Marduk, we're like this. We're tight together. So if you don't obey me, that's like not obeying Marduk. You don't want that. So you need to obey me. That was this whole complex of interwoven developments. We also then have the issue of, well, you know what? These kings can be tyrannical. They say they're ruling for the gods. Are they really? And we have the earliest epic, because we have the Enuma Elish, the form we have it is 2nd century BCE. So it's Babylon is about 1750. But we have the Epic of Gilgamesh, which goes back very early to the 3rd century BCE. And the Epic of Gilgamesh, you may have heard about it, you may actually have read it. It's actually very short, at least in the Penguin edition. So I would encourage you actually to read it. It's a fantastic read. It's about what makes for a good king. Gilgamesh was like the 3rd king of Ur, or maybe it is Uruk. I always forget. Was he king of Ur or Uruk? I forget. Anyway, one of the two. And actually, in the king's list, in the list of kings in these cuneiform Akkadian Sumerian bilingual lists, one is of kings, and Gilgamesh is listed there. So we can say, okay, he probably was a historical figure. Whether or not he was the way the myth explained it is another issue. It is the way the myth goes is Gilgamesh just thought the greatest of himself. He thought he was fantastic. He lorded it over his people, and the people started complaining. They said, no, a king should be a shepherd to his people, not lord it over them. There's so many fantastic things in the Epic of Gilgamesh, including one of the earliest accounts of the Great Flood that predates the biblical account by at least 600 years, if not more. Um, and so I'll get to that in a second. So Gilgamesh is just being a horrible ruler. And the people complain to the gods, and the gods get together and say, "Okay, we will do something about this," and we create Gilgamesh's equal, so to speak, named Enkidu, a wild man. And I think it's all fascinating relationships in terms of sexuality and power and everything and divinity, because Enkidu was completely wild. He would run with the beasts. With the gazelles. He could run with the gazelles. He would have hair everywhere. Everybody loved, all the animals loved Gilgamesh. Um, and then there was an issue of him having to go meet, or not Gilgamesh, but Enkidu. All the animals loved Enkidu. Um, and a herder from Uruk saw him and said, "Okay, what do I do? And what do I do? And how do I use this force of nature, this new wild man?" And his father said, "You have to go capture him, or what you need to do is bring him a prostitute that will tame him." So that's what the guy does. He goes and gets a prostitute, brings her to Enkidu. Enkidu is like, "Whoa, okay," and they go at it for about a week or so. And after all of that, Enkidu, as the text says, became weak. No longer did the gazelles run with him. They kind of fled from him and everything. So he lost his naturalness. So he goes back to the prostitute. He says, "What happened?" And he says, "You have become, you have become weak. You have become a god." This inversion is bizarre. It's like you become human. You're becoming human, therefore you're becoming like a god, which is just a perverse switch. But anyway, so after being tamed by the prostitute, Enkidu then goes to meet Gilgamesh, and they fight, and neither of them win, and they finally say, "Wow, you're both great. You're great. You're great." And they become bosom buddies, like two sides of the same coin, so to speak. And so they go on and they do great things, and then one of the goddesses says, "You know what? I can't have this. I want to marry Gilgamesh." And Gilgamesh says, "No, I'm not interested in you at all." And so the goddess says, "Okay, well, I'm going to get you." And she tries to kill Enkidu and Gilgamesh, but especially Enkidu. She sends down the bowl of heaven, but Enkidu and Gilgamesh kill the bowl of heaven. And then she finally sends a disease that kills Enkidu. A disease kills these powerful people. There's nothing they can do about it. He can't fight a disease. And Enkidu dies. And Gilgamesh is completely devastated. How can I continue living? How can I continue living? So he goes on his search for eternal life. I want to live forever. So he goes on this long journey and finds many things. He comes upon, finally, he hears about this person, Utnashpatim, who had become immortal. So he finds Utnashpatim and he says, "How do I become immortal?" And Utnashpatim says, "Well, you really can't. You shouldn't really worry about it anyway." He says, "Well, how did you become immortal?" So, well, this is the story of the flood. Because of the Tiamat trying to get rid of everything, one of the things they did too was, it doesn't make sense with the Babylonian creation myth and Marduk, but the gods were going to get rid of everybody, so they were going to send this big flood to get rid of everything that had been created. But someone told him, came to him and said, "Okay, now this is what's going to happen, so you better be prepared. What you need to do is build this big ship, and I'll give you the dimensions for doing so, and you need to bring a male and a female of every species onto your ship. That will preserve you from dying. That will preserve all of us." So that's what Utnashpatim did. The rain came. He had brought everybody into the ship, and it all worked. And when the rain finally subsided, the ship came to rest. They sent it all out. Finally, after the third day or so, the waters had receded. They could get out. And then the guys said, "Uh-oh, what happened? We were screwed. We can't allow this, and so we're going to make Utnashpatim divine." And Gilgamesh was cool. Well, okay, that's not going to happen again. So is there anything other way I can get it? And there was this. He had to go down to this river and find this plant, which he failed to do, and he was all upset. And Utnashpatim tells him, he says, "What your quest is ridiculous, because you can become immortal. You can become immortal in the memories, in the minds and memories of your people. to be a good king. That's what you should do. Go back and be a good king. Be the shepherd of the people, and they will then hail you, and you will live on for eternity in the memory of your accomplishments. And that's what Gilgamesh did, and the people praised him, and all ended happily ever after. What we see here with Gilgamesh, it's the myth of what makes for a good king, to be a shepherd to his people, to support his people, not to lord it over them and dominate them. And this myth is then to explains what is justice in the sense of what is a just ruler. Because Gilgamesh at first wasn't. He had to be physically basically beaten into being a just ruler, and then meet defeat by the hands of the death of Enkidu, and then not being able to gain immortality except by the memory. That would be what would live on, the memory that the people had. Now, we have the emergence of myth. We have the emergence of religion. We have the emergence of writing. We have the emergence of the state and everything else. We have another emergence thing to deal with, and that's the emergence of law. I'm going to go through this quickly because we have one of the earliest complete code of law. The earliest complete code of law is known as the Code of Hammurabi, and this dates from about 1750 BCE. In Hammurabi was king of Babylon. It is preserved on a stone, a stela, and this next slide that says Hammurabi's Code. There is, okay, we say, well, it's a phallic symbol. It's like, yes, it is. But it's on this stone that is written, these are like 292 laws, I believe it is, or so. And they cover everything from, let's say, tort to criminal law. Tort is, what happens if you damage somebody else's property. What happens if you injure somebody. And it's fascinating to see because it is done by class: nobles, free, and slaves. This too is where we find one of the earliest examples of what's known as the lex talionis. The lex talionis, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That only applies to equals. So if you are a noble, and if you, by mistake, put out the eye of another noble, your eye has to be put out. If you are a noble and you put out the eye of a free man who's not noble, you have to pay him money. If you put out the eye of a slave, you have to pay the slave's owner money. That type of hierarchy is there. Now, Hammurabi has a preface where he says he is doing this for Marduk and is to protect the poor. A rule of law to protect the poor. That's what this is about. You say, what doesn't really protect the poor? Is it harsh? Oh, yes, it's harsh. In our terms. But compared to just no law and haphazard being able to do anything, it's a real positive. It covers, divorce law or marriage law, who can marry whom, and can people get divorced. And there was cases where women could divorce if their husband was being abusive and that they could prove it. So it even guards women's rights to an extent there. Now, I'm not trying to say that, women were equal with men in that society in any way, shape, or form. That's not going back to the veneration and worship of the mother goddess, where it was a female kind of pantheon and divinity. This is after the malification of the pantheon. We're still then in a very male world, both in terms of the pantheon and the divine world and everything else. But yet they recognize that there needs to be some sort of protection. So even though it is stratified, it is designed by society to set a rule of law for all of society. And it was there, and it was done so in the service of Marduk and Shamash, who was serving with Marduk. So that's kind of how it all worked out. And it was done with Hammurabi. Now, Hammurabi's code was not the earliest law code. There are bits and pieces of evidence of earlier law codes, but it's the earliest complete law code that we have. And it's a fascinating insight into Babylonian, therefore ancient Mesopotamian society. Now, reflections. Nature, religion, law, and human civilization. We've seen the emergence of religion. We've seen the emergence of writing. We've seen the emergence of law. We've seen the emergence of empire. All part of civilization that began with life in the cities, the beginnings of writing and everything else. Civilization and violence, I pointed to it earlier on. What does that mean for us in our approach to civilization and our understanding of it? You say, oh, that's just ancient people. That's just the emergent. There's no violent anymore, really. Or is civilization not violent? What's going on in the world today? What has been going on for ever so long? Wars, conflict, that's violence. In some ways, we've become increasingly violent as human beings. But we see that already with the emergence of civilization. An increase in violence. I'm not saying that there was never conflict or violence within the Neolithic period of hunters and gatherers before the agricultural revolution and everything. I'm not saying that whatsoever. I'm sure there was. Not that we have evidence of it, but I'm sure there was. But not to the extent that we almost have an institutionalized violence with the emergence of civilization, whereby civilization is itself inherently, by definition, of violence, a development of violence in terms of responding to, guarding from, trying to protect from, as well as in exerting with empire and things, violence. What does that mean for it? Is civilization then a good thing? To say, I'm so civilized? How does it change our understanding? That's one of the things I want you to think about. And how do we understand this concept of justice and the just state? Now, I will be arguing here, whereas as I think I've said, that the theme of this course is justice and the just state. What is it? And we released it with the Greeks, which I'll get to next week. I think it is already. Maybe even next lecture, which I'll have to go back and look. Where Plato is actually asking the question, what is justice and what makes for a just state? But we see that already with the Epic of Gilgamesh, implicitly in there. What makes for a good king, a just king? So the very earliest part. What did Marduk try to do with the Enuma Elish account? To bring harmony between the gods and then human beings, but between the gods, so we have to create human beings to appease the gods, to bring harmony, so that there's harmony. Justice is partly harmony, to restore harmony. We see it with the Code of Hammurabi, is to restore peace and harmony. What makes for a just state? Now, the explicit question I'll be arguing is a distinctively Western question, so that the myth of the West almost becomes synonymous with, or at least inherent within, the question of, or vice versa, the question of what is justice and what is a just state becomes inherently part of the myth of the West, which in the general sense is what is the myth of the West. It's like what is the myth of Western civilization? The myth of Western civilization is the myth of the West, whereby the myth of the West is the myth of the West, or the myth of Western civilization is Western civilization. That's what we're looking at. The myth of Western civilization is Western civilization. This whole development, emergence, how does it justify itself? How does it develop as a distinctive form of civilization? Whereby civilization is far broader than Western civilization. And civilization is a particular form of human culture which is far broader than civilized culture. That's what we're looking at. And how are we to understand justice, the just state, and the issue of violence as civilization becomes increasingly evolved, complex, and at some point becomes uniquely and distinctively Western. We'll get there when we get there. And if this is the case, that civilization and violence go hand in hand, and that if we become increasingly violent, is there progress in civilization? Do we progress to a state that we're better, more elevated than what has come before? Or is it simply different? Do we know more? Oh, yes, we know a lot more than the ancient Mesopotamians, without question, in terms of the natural world and everything else. But have we progressed? Are we happier? Do we live in a more just society? Well, we have our laws. what makes for justice and what makes for a just state, what makes for our living together in peace and harmony and justice, because we haven't really been able to achieve that. And how do we justify it? And is it for only a few people, or is it for everyone? If it's for everyone, how do we deal with that? Those are the questions that this course, I think, forces upon us. And there are no clear answers. There are good answers and bad answers based on the extant evidence. If we do not base our understanding and our answers on the extant evidence, that means that which is, that which we can physically analyze and touch. And so then we're just making things up and creating our own individualized myth with no basis that we can point to for reality. That was the whole basis of the development of writing to begin with, to provide evidence. If we don't provide evidence, we can make up whatever we want. And that can lead to even more violence than if we have some sort of common basis. These are the questions I want you to think about, write about, focus on for the rest of the course. But it all starts here in this lecture of the emergence of civilization itself. And we'll see how it develops from here. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.